The weight of 80 years felt like iron as Mona Scott lay pinned against the cold mahogany floor of her foyer. Above her, the grandfather clock ticked with a mocking, rhythmic precision, marking the seconds of a life that felt like it was leaking away. Her hip was a screaming epicenter of white-hot agony, the result of a single, treacherous slip. Just 10 feet away, her smartphone sat on the charging dock, blinking incessantly. It was the family group chat. She could almost see the names dancing on the screen. Elsa Wills, Mike, Bekky. They were likely debating which restaurant to visit for Sunday brunch, unaware that the matriarch of the Scott family was currently dying in the dark. Mona reached out, her fingers clawing at the rug, but the pain forced a ragged gasp from her lungs. She was a woman who had built an empire from a small bakery, who had raised her children with a steel spine, yet now she was reduced to a ghost in her own home. The silence of the house was more than just an absence of sound. It was a physical manifestation of her family's neglect. For months, they had treated her like a fading portrait on the wall, admired from a distance but rarely touched. Her calls were ignored or met with, "I'm in a meeting, Mom," and her wisdom was dismissed as the rambling of a woman who had stayed too long at the party. With a trembling hand, she pressed the emergency pendant around her neck. Nothing. The small green light remained dark. The battery, the one thing she relied on for safety, had finally died, much like the attention span of her children. Despair began to settle into her bones, heavier than the physical trauma. She stared at the mail slot in the front door, the only connection left to the outside world. Just as the shadows of the evening began to swallow the room, a sharp thud broke the silence. A heavy, cream-colored envelope slid through the slot. It wasn't a bill or a flyer. On the back, in jagged, unfamiliar handwriting, were three words: "They want you dead." Mona's breath hitched as a heavy shadow eclipsed the light coming from the porch window. The jagged words on the envelope burned into Mona's mind. "They want you dead." The pain in her hip was momentarily eclipsed by a surge of pure, primal adrenaline. She watched the shadow at the door, a tall, unmoving silhouette that blocked out the street lamp. Was it Mike? Was it Steve? Or was it someone far more sinister? Mona tried to drag herself toward the shadows of the hallway, her fingernails digging into the wood grain. She felt like a wounded animal, trapped in a cage of her own history. She had spent decades providing for Elsa Wills and the rest of them, and now, the very walls she had built felt like they were closing in to finish her off. Suddenly, the shadow moved. Instead of a key turning in the lock, there was the sound of a heavy metal bolt being slid into place from the outside. Someone was locking her in. Panic, cold and suffocating, rose in Mona's throat. She managed to pull herself toward the small side table, reaching for the heavy brass lamp. If someone was coming for her, she wouldn't go quietly. But as she gripped the cold metal, she heard the muffled sound of a car idling in the driveway, a low, guttural engine that sounded exactly like Mike's vintage Mustang. Mona's heart felt like it was being squeezed by a cold hand. Could her own son be standing on the other side of that door, ensuring she couldn't escape? The betrayal tasted like copper in her mouth. She remembered the way Mike had looked at her during the last family dinner, his eyes darting toward the antique silver, his hands restless. She had dismissed it as stress, but now, the pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. They didn't see a mother, they saw an inheritance. A faint scratching sound started at the back of the house, near the kitchen. It was the sound of a window being pried open. Mona's eyes widened as she realized she was no longer alone. The intruder wasn't waiting for her to die of old age. They were coming to accelerate the process. She looked down at the envelope again, and as it caught the moonlight, she saw a small, dried bloodstain in the corner. Then the kitchen door creaked open, and a voice whispered into the darkness, "Is it done yet?" Mona froze, her cheek pressed against the floor, as the footsteps moved through the kitchen. They were light, rhythmic, the sound of someone who knew exactly where the floorboards creaked. It wasn't the heavy tread of Mike or the clumsy gait of Steve. It was the confident, clicking sound of heels. Mona's blood ran cold. Elsa Wills. Her own daughter was in the house, but she wasn't calling out for her mother. She was moving toward the safe in the study. The hatred Mona felt in that moment was a physical heat that temporarily numbed her hip. She had given Elsa everything: the best schools, the down payment on her house, the very jewelry she wore to high society galas. And in return, Elsa was treating her mother's potential death as a business transaction. Mona heard the muffled beep of the electronic keypad. 5122, her birthday. They were so predictable, so clinical in their betrayal. "The old woman is still breathing," a second voice hissed. This one was male, low, and rasping. "Uncle Harbor?" Mona's brother-in-law, the web of betrayal was expanding, entangling everyone she had ever trusted. It doesn't matter, Elsa's voice replied, devoid of any warmth. The lawyer said the new will is only valid if she signs it tonight. If she passes away before then, the 1998 version stands. We lose the estate to the foundation. Mona realized with a jolt of horror that she wasn't just being left to die, she was being hunted for a signature. They needed her alive, but only long enough to strip her of her legacy. She looked at the heavy brass lamp in her hand. She was an old woman, yes, but she was the one who had taught them how to fight. As Elsa and Harbor moved into the hallway, their flashlights cutting through the dark, Mona saw the glint of a needle in Harbor's hand. He wasn't looking for a pen. He was looking for a vein. Just as their light swept over her prone body, the front door suddenly rattled violently, and a frantic voice screamed from the porch, "Mona, open the door, they're coming for the girl." The scream from the porch sent Elsa and Harbor scrambling back into the shadows of the kitchen. The flashlight beams vanished, leaving Mona in a terrifying, pulsating darkness. Who was at the door? And which girl were they talking about? Mona's mind raced to Bekky, her youngest granddaughter. Bekky was the only one who still looked at Mona with love, the only one who didn't seem to be counting the silver. If they had Bekky, Mona's hip would have to stop hurting. She had to move. With a grunt of pure willpower, Mona rolled onto her stomach and began to crawl toward the basement door. It was the only room in the house that locked from the inside. Every movement felt like a hot knife was being twisted in her pelvis, but the thought of Bekky in danger acted like a fuel. Behind her, she heard the sound of glass shattering. Someone had finally broken in through the front. The house was now a battlefield, and she was the target. She reached the basement door and hauled herself up using the knob. As she swung the door open and tumbled onto the landing, she heard Aunt Luciana's shrill voice echoing from the foyer. "She's not in the hall. Find her. We don't have much time before the police respond to the alarm." Mona slammed the door shut and threw the bolt. She slumped against the wood, gasping for air in the damp, cedar-scented dark of the basement. She thought she was safe for a second until she heard a soft, rhythmic breathing coming from the corner of the room. She fumbled for the light switch, her fingers shaking. When the dim yellow bulb flickered to life, she didn't see Bekky. Instead, she saw a row of black garbage bags, all filled with her own clothes and belongings, already packed away as if she were already dead. Sitting atop the bags was a laptop, its screen glowing. On the screen was a live feed of her own bedroom upstairs. Someone had been filming her for weeks. As Mona leaned closer to the screen, she saw the bedroom door open. A figure entered, carrying a gasoline can. It was Steve. He began to douse her bed, the very place she was supposed to be sleeping. But then, the video feed flickered and changed. It showed the basement stairs, and the door she had just locked was being doused from the other side. The smell of gasoline began to seep through the cracks of the basement door, thick and suffocating. Mona stared at the wood, her mind reeling. They weren't just waiting for her to die, they were going to erase her. The hatred she felt was no longer a flicker. It was a roaring furnace that matched the heat beginning to rise from the doorframe. Her own family, Steve, Elsa, Harbor, they were all participants in this macabre play. They had planned this down to the very garbage bags she was sitting on. "It's better this way, Auntie." Steve's voice came through the door, muffled but chillingly calm. "The insurance will cover the house and the estate will be settled. No more hospital bills, no more nursing home debates. You'll be a tragic accident, a hero of the past." Mona felt a cold, hard resolve settle over her. She looked around the basement. This was where she kept her old baking supplies, including the industrial-sized canisters of flour and the heavy-duty cleaning chemicals. She might be old, but she knew chemistry. She knew that in a confined space, certain dusts were more explosive than gasoline. If they wanted a tragedy, she would give them a catastrophe, but she wouldn't be the only victim. She began to drag herself toward the shelves, knocking over a container of fine powdered sugar and flour, creating a thick white cloud in the air. Her lungs burned, but she didn't stop. She reached for the old gas water heater in the corner. If she could loosen the valve, the pilot light would do the rest. Just as her hand touched the cold metal of the gas line, she heard a frantic pounding on the small, high basement window. She looked up and saw Becky's face, pale and tear-streaked, pressed against the glass. The girl was holding up a phone, showing a recorded video of the family meeting where they had planned the fire. "Grandma, I have the proof," she screamed. But behind Bekky, a dark figure rose from the bushes, grabbing the girl by the hair and pulling her away into the night. Mona gripped the gas valve, her eyes fixed on the empty window. Her family was outside, her granddaughter was being kidnapped, and the door behind her was beginning to catch fire. She had one choice: stay and burn or trigger the explosion and take the whole house and everyone in it. The hiss of the gas valve was a death rattle in the cramped basement. Mona's hands, gnarled by decades of hard labor, didn't tremble as the smell of methane began to compete with the choking fumes of gasoline. Above her, the floorboards groaned under the weight of her betrayers. She could hear them, Elsa, Mike, and Steve, arguing over who would light the match. They were vultures fighting over a carcass that was still warm. But it was the image of Bekky being dragged away that fueled Mona's final, desperate surge of strength. She couldn't blow the house yet, not while her only ally was in the clutches of that shadow. "Grandma, please." Becky's voice echoed faintly from outside again, cut off by a brutal thud. Mona's heart shattered. The hatred she felt for her children was a cold, crystalline thing. She had spent a lifetime building a foundation for them, and they had turned it into a pyre. She looked at the gas valve, then at the small, high basement window. It was too small for her to fit through, and her hip was a mangled mess of agony. But next to the window was the old coal chute, a remnant of the house's original 1920s design. It was narrow, rusted, and led directly to the side yard. With a groan that sounded like tearing metal, Mona hauled herself toward the chute. Every inch was a battle against gravity and her own failing body. She could hear the first whoosh of flame from above. The fire had been lit. The ceiling was turning a hellish orange. She reached the chute and grabbed the rusted handle of the iron door. It was stuck. She threw her entire weight against it, her shoulders screaming in protest. Behind her, the basement door finally burned through. Steve stood there, framed by a halo of fire, a look of pure, detached malice on his face. He wasn't surprised to see her moving. He looked disappointed she wasn't already dead. "You always were stubborn, Mona," he shouted over the roar of the flames. He stepped into the basement, a heavy wrench in his hand. He wasn't going to let the fire do all the work. He wanted to feel the life leave her. Just as he swung the wrench, Mona's hand found a heavy glass jar of pickled beets on the shelf and smashed it against his temple. As he slumped, she gave the chute door one final, desperate kick. It swung open, but as she tumbled into the narrow tunnel, she realized the chute didn't lead to the yard. It led into a sub-basement she hadn't known existed. Mona slid down the metal incline, landing hard on a dirt floor that smelled of damp earth and ancient secrets. The sub-basement was tiny, barely a crawl space, but as her eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the chute, she saw something that stopped her breath. It was a sturdy, metal lockbox with the initials HS, Harbor Scott. Her husband's brother, the man who was currently upstairs trying to finish her off. She fumbled with the latch, her fingers slick with beet juice and sweat. The box popped open, revealing a stack of ledgers and a collection of legal documents. These weren't just estate papers. These were records of a decades-long embezzlement scheme. Harbor hadn't just been helping the family, he had been systematically draining the Scott family bakery's pension fund for years. And the signatures on the bottom of the transfers weren't just his. Elsa and Mike had been signing off on the thefts since they were in their 20s. The realization hit Mona harder than the fall. Her children hadn't just become greedy in her old age, they had been parasites their entire lives. The love they had shown her over the years was a performance designed to keep her from looking at the books. She wasn't just a mother to them. She was a bank account with a heartbeat. The hatred she felt now was transformative. It replaced her pain with a terrifying, icy clarity. She realized that the note slid under her door, "They want you dead," might not have been from a stranger. It might have been a warning from someone who knew exactly what was in this box. Above her, the house shook. An explosion, likely the flour dust she had kicked up, rocked the foundations. Dust and debris rained down on her. She tucked the ledger into her sweater, clutching it like a shield. She had the proof to destroy them all, but she was still trapped underground. Suddenly, a hand reached through the coal chute, but it wasn't Steve's. It was a hand wearing a distinctive gold signet ring she recognized instantly. It belonged to the one person who should have been dead for 10 years, her husband, Henry. "Mona, take my hand." The voice was raspy, aged, but undeniably Henry's. Mona stared up at the chute in a daze. Henry Scott had been declared lost at sea during a fishing trip a decade ago. There had been a funeral. There had been a will. His death was the very event that had allowed Harbor to take control of the family finances. As his fingers gripped hers, they felt real, calloused, and warm. He hauled her up with a strength that defied his apparent age, pulling her through the chute and into the cool night air of the hydrangea bushes. Mona gasped as she hit the grass, looking up at the man standing over her. He looked like a weathered version of the husband she remembered, his face lined with a decade of hiding. "Henry, how?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "No time, Mona," he hissed, his eyes darting toward the burning house. "They think I'm dead, and they need you to join me. If they see us together, neither of us makes it to morning." He looked toward the driveway where Mike and Aunt Luciana were standing near the Mustang, watching the roof collapse. They weren't crying, they were checking their watches. "They have Bekky," Mona said, grabbing his arm. "They took her, Henry." "Your own granddaughter." Henry's expression darkened into something truly frightening. "I know, Harbor has her in the old tool shed. He thinks she's the one who sent you the note. He's going to dispose of the witness before the fire department arrives." Mona looked at the burning ruins of her life, and then at the man she thought she'd lost. The betrayal by her children was compounded by the mystery of Henry's disappearance, but there was no time for explanations. She had the ledger, and he had the location of the girl. As they began to creep through the shadows toward the shed, a bright spotlight suddenly cut through the darkness, pinning them both against the fence. "Well, look at this," a voice boomed over a megaphone. It was Uncle Harbor, standing on the roof of the tool shed holding a flare gun. "The dead have risen, it's a miracle. Too bad miracles don't last." He leveled the flare gun directly at Henry's chest. The flare ignited with a violent hiss, a streak of blinding red light that narrowly missed Henry's shoulder, splashing against the dry cedar fence behind them. The wood caught instantly, creating a wall of fire that boxed them in. Harbor laughed, a high, frantic sound that signaled he had finally lost his grip on reality. "You should have stayed in the water, Henry. And you, Mona, you should have just signed the papers. We could have let you live out your days in a nice, quiet home." Mona felt a surge of loathing so powerful it made her stand upright, defying the agony in her hip. "A home you paid for with the money you stole from your own brother?" She screamed back, clutching the ledger. "I have the books, Harbor. I know about the pension fund. I know Elsa and Mike helped you." The laughter stopped abruptly. Harbor's face contorted into a mask of pure hatred. Below him, inside the shed, Mona heard a muffled cry and the sound of kicking. Bekky was in there, and the fence fire was spreading toward the shed's walls. The girl was going to be roasted alive while they stood there arguing over money. "Mike, Steve, get over here," Harbor roared. From the front of the house, the two men appeared, their faces blackened by soot, looking like demons birthed from the house's destruction. They saw their father, the man they thought was a ghost, and for a second they wavered. But then Harbor pointed at the ledger in Mona's hand. "She has the proof. If she leaves this yard, we all go to prison for the rest of our lives. Kill them." "Kill them both." Steve, still dazed from the jar Mona had smashed over his head, lunged forward with a kitchen knife. Henry stepped in front of Mona, preparing to fight, but he was an old man against a younger, stronger opponent. As Steve closed the distance, the ground beneath them groaned. The old well cover, hidden under years of overgrowth and weakened by the heat of the fire, began to crumble. Just as Steve jumped toward them, the earth opened up. A sickening crack echoed through the yard as the rotted wood and stone of the well gave way. Steve disappeared into the black maw of the earth with a truncated scream. A second later, a distant, wet thud signaled he had hit the bottom of the 60-foot shaft. Mike skidded to a halt at the edge, his face pale with horror. The fire from the fence was now licking at the eaves of the tool shed, and the smell of smoke was becoming unbearable. "Steve!" Mike yelled, looking into the pit. There was no answer. He looked back at Mona and Henry, his eyes wild. The greed was still there, but it was now mixed with a frantic, cornered animal terror. "Give me the ledger, Mom," he pleaded, his voice trembling. "We can tell them Steve started the fire. We can say he went crazy. Just give me the books and we can fix this." Mona looked at her son, the boy she had tucked in, the man she had believed in, and saw nothing but a stranger. "There is no fixing this, Mike," she said coldly. "You chose your side the moment you doused my bed in gasoline." Above them, Harbor was frantically trying to reload the flare gun, but his hands were shaking too much. He looked down at the shed, which was now beginning to billow thick, black smoke. "The girl is as good as dead anyway," he shrieked. "You want her, go get her." He kicked a heavy iron bar across the shed door, effectively deadbolting it from the outside, and then jumped from the roof into the darkness of the neighboring woods. Henry didn't hesitate. He ran toward the burning shed, throwing his weight against the door. "Mona, the bar, I can't lift it alone." Mona hobbled forward, the heat blistering her skin. Together, the two elders, the supposed weak members of the family, strained against the iron. Behind them, Mike saw his chance. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, snub-nosed revolver. He didn't aim at the ledger, he aimed at his father's back. "I'm sorry, Dad," he whispered, "but I'm not going to jail." Just as his finger tightened on the trigger, the front door of the burning house exploded outward, and Aunt Luciana ran out, screaming in agony, her clothes a mass of flames. She stumbled directly into Mike, sending the shot wild. The bullet didn't hit Henry, it hit the gas tank of the Mustang parked 10 feet away. The explosion of the Mustang's gas tank was a deafening roar that swallowed Aunt Luciana's screams. The shockwave threw Mike backward, the revolver flying from his hand and disappearing into the tall, burning grass. Mona and Henry were shielded by the heavy oak door of the tool shed, but the heat was now a physical wall, threatening to singe the very air in their lungs. Inside the shed, Becky's muffled cries had turned into desperate, rhythmic thuds. The girl was running out of oxygen. "Again, Mona, push!" Henry roared, his face purple with exertion. Mona ignored the agonizing grating of her hip bone and threw her entire soul into the iron bar. With a screech of protesting metal, the bolt gave way. The door swung open, and a cloud of thick, acrid smoke billowed out. Henry plunged into the darkness, emerging seconds later with a limp, soot-covered Becky in his arms. She was unconscious but breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. Mona felt a momentary flash of relief, but it was extinguished when she looked back toward the driveway. Mike was crawling toward the spot where his gun had landed, his face a mask of frantic desperation. Beyond him, the main house was a towering inferno, a skeleton of glowing embers. The fire department sirens were finally audible in the distance, but they were miles away. They were alone in the dark with a man who had nothing left to lose. "Get her to the woods," Mona commanded Henry, her voice sounding like grinding gravel. "Go, I'll find the gun." She didn't wait for his protest. She began to crawl through the grass, her hands searching for the cold steel of the revolver. She had lived a life of peace, of baking bread and tending gardens, but that woman had died on the foyer floor. The woman who remained was a creature of survival. Her fingers brushed against something hard and metallic. She gripped the handle, but as she looked up, she saw Mike's boots. He had found it first. He stood over her, the barrel pointed directly between her eyes. "Give me the ledger, Mom," he sobbed, his voice a pathetic mix of hatred and grief. "Just give it to me, and I'll let you walk away." Mona looked up at her son, and for the first time in her life she felt absolutely nothing for him. Not love, not pity, only a profound, icy disgust. "You don't have the stomach for it, Mike," she said, her voice steady. "You never did, you always let Steve or Harbor do the dirty work. You're just a coward in a designer suit." Mike's hand shook violently. The sirens were getting louder, the red and blue lights reflecting off the smoke-filled sky. He looked at the burning house, then back at his mother. "I'm a businessman," he shrieked. "You kept us on a leash, you and Dad and your morals. We deserved more." "You deserved what you earned," Mona countered, which was nothing. She watched his finger whiten on the trigger. She was prepared to die, but she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her blink. Suddenly, a heavy, wet hand reached out from the mouth of the open well behind Mike. Steve, broken, bloodied, but fueled by a sociopathic rage, hauled himself out of the pit like a demon climbing out of the underworld. He didn't go for Mona. He lunged at Mike's legs, dragging him toward the edge of the crumbling masonry. Mike screamed, the gun firing harmlessly into the air as he tumbled backward. Both men crashed into the side of the well, the remaining stones giving way. Mona watched as her son and her nephew clawed at each other, a tangle of limbs and legacy, before they both vanished once more into the darkness of the earth. This time there was no splash, only the sound of heavy stones settling. Mona sat in the grass, the ledger still clutched to her chest. She was the last one standing in the ruins of her home. But as she turned to find Henry and Becky, she saw a car idling at the end of the long driveway. It wasn't a police car or a fire truck. It was a black sedan she didn't recognize. The driver's side window rolled down, and the face of Elsa Will stared out at her. Elsa wasn't crying for her brothers or her home. She was holding a cell phone, and on the screen was a live tracking map of the ledger. "You forgot about the GPS tag in the binding, Mother." Elsa's voice drifted across the yard, cold and clinical. "Now, get in the car, or Uncle Harbor finishes what he started with the girl." Mona felt the world tilt. Henry and Becky were gone. Elsa must have intercepted them as they tried to reach the road. With no choice left, Mona hobbled toward the sedan, the ledger feeling like a lead weight in her arms. She climbed into the passenger seat, the smell of expensive leather and Elsa's perfume clashing sickeningly with the scent of smoke and gasoline on her own skin. Elsa didn't look at her. She put the car in gear and sped away from the burning estate, the sirens finally arriving just as they disappeared into the tree line. Where are they? Mona demanded, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and exhaustion. Harbor is taking them to the old cannery, Elsa replied, her eyes fixed on the road. He's convinced there's a second set of keys to the offshore accounts hidden in your safety deposit box. You're going to give them to us, and then we're going to help you relocate to a very private facility in Europe. You killed your brothers, Elsa, Mona said, her voice a low hiss. Steve and Mike are in that well. Louisiana is a cinder. Does any of that matter to you? Elsa's grip on the steering wheel tightened, her knuckles turning white. They were weak, Mother. Mike was a gambler and Steve was a thug. They were going to blow the whole thing. I'm the only one who actually knows how to manage the Scott legacy. You should be proud of me. I'm the only one who actually inherited your iron will. The betrayal was complete. Elsa wasn't just a participant. She was the architect. She had let her brothers play the roles of the villains while she waited in the wings to collect the spoils. As they sped down the darkened highway, Mona realized that the ledger wasn't her only weapon. She reached into her pocket and felt the small, jagged piece of glass she had tucked away from the broken beet jar. She looked at Elsa's perfect, composed profile. The hatred was no longer a fire, it was a surgical tool. I'll give you the keys, Mona said quietly. But first I need to see Bekky. Elsa smiled, a thin, predatory curve of the lips. Of course, Mother, we aren't monsters. But as she spoke, she reached for a heavy medical syringe in the center console. The car swerved as Mona lunged, not for the wheel, but for Elsa's throat. The glass shard in her hand caught the light for a fraction of a second before she pressed it against her daughter's jugular. Drop the needle, Elsa, Mona growled, the adrenaline of a cornered mother overriding 80 years of physical decay. Or I'll see how iron your will is when your carotid is open. Elsa gasped, her composure shattering instantly. She dropped the syringe, her eyes wide with a terror she hadn't anticipated from the frail old woman. The car fishtailed, tires screaming against the asphalt, before slamming into a ditch. The airbag deployed with a violent thwack, pinning Elsa against the seat. Mona, who had braced herself, was thrown against the door, the pain in her hip now a dull, distant roar compared to the fire in her heart. She kicked the door open and rolled into the dirt, clutching the ledger. She needed to find the cannery. She knew these woods, she had hiked them with Henry when they were young and full of hope. She began to trek through the undergrowth, the moon providing just enough light to see the silhouettes of the rusted industrial buildings in the distance. As she approached the cannery, she saw the silhouette of Henry tied to a chair in the center of the loading dock. Harbor was pacing around him, a gasoline canister in one hand and a flare in the other. He was talking to himself, a frantic, disjointed monologue about ending the cycle and starting fresh. But Bekky was nowhere to be seen. Mona moved closer, her heart hammering against her ribs. She needed a distraction. She looked at the old electrical transformer outside the building. If she could short it out, the whole place would go dark. She reached for a fallen branch, but a hand suddenly clamped over her mouth from behind. A familiar, gravelly voice whispered into her ear, "Don't move, Mona, he's not alone." She turned her head slightly and saw the face of Uncle Harbor's long-lost son, the one they said had died in the war, the one who looked exactly like the man she had seen in the shadows at her front door. The man holding her wasn't an enemy, not yet. He was pale, covered in scars, and his eyes held a hollow look that spoke of unspeakable things. "I'm the one who sent the note," he whispered, his grip loosening just enough for her to breathe. "I've been watching them for months. I wanted to see if any of them had a soul left. They don't." "Where is Bekky?" Mona hissed, her eyes locked on the loading dock where Harbor was now dousing Henry in fuel. "She's inside in the cold storage," he replied. "But there's a complication. Aunt Luciana didn't die in the fire. She's inside with the girl and she's lost her mind. She thinks Bekky is the one who set her on fire." Mona felt a fresh wave of horror. The family was a hydra. Every time she cut off a head, two more appeared, each more twisted than the last. She looked at Harbor, who was now holding the flare inches from Henry's face. "The account's Henry. Tell me the password, or we both go up." The Shadow Sun handed Mona a heavy iron pipe. "I'll take Harbor, you get the girl. But be careful, Mona, the cold storage is a vacuum seal. If the power goes out, the doors lock from the inside, and the air stops pumping." Mona didn't hesitate. She began to crawl toward the side entrance of the cannery, her body moving on instinct alone. She reached the heavy, insulated door of the cold storage unit. She could hear Louisiana's high-pitched, manic singing from within. Mona gripped the handle and pulled, but it wouldn't budge. Through the small, frosted window, she saw Becky slumped in a corner, her face blue from the cold. Behind her, the charred, skeletal remains of Aunt Luciana stood with a meat hook in her hand, her eyes glowing with a demonic light. Just as Mona began to pound on the glass, the lights in the entire facility flickered and died. The mechanical clunk of the vacuum seal engaging echoed through the silent building. The silence that followed the vacuum seal was more terrifying than the roar of the fire. Mona stood in the pitch-black hallway of the cannery, her hands pressed against the reinforced steel door of the cold storage unit. Inside, Becky was trapped with a woman who had been burned into a monster. Mona could hear the faint, rhythmic scratching of the meat hook against the metal walls. Aunt Luciana was no longer a person. She was a vessel for all the resentment and hatred the Scott family had cultivated for decades. "Open it!" Mona screamed, her voice cracking as she pounded her fists against the door. "Luciana, she's just a child. This isn't her fault. It's everyone's fault." Luciana's voice shrieked from within, muffled and distorted by the insulation. "You kept the money, you kept the glory, and now look at me. I'm a ghost while you still have your skin." Mona felt a cold hand on her shoulder. It was the shadow son, his face barely visible in the emergency red glow that had flickered on. "The seal is magnetic," he whispered. "We can't pull it open from the outside without power. But the manual override is in the basement, submerged in the old cooling pipes. If I go down there, I can't help Henry. Harbor is about to drop that flare." Mona looked at the door, then at the loading dock where her husband was seconds away from becoming a human torch. The hatred she felt for Harbor and Louisiana was a physical weight, but the love for her granddaughter was a spark. "Go to the basement," Mona commanded. "I'll deal with Harbor." She didn't have a gun, and her hip was a ruin, but she had the ledger. She stepped out onto the loading dock, into the line of sight of the man who had destroyed her life. "Harbor," she yelled, holding the ledger high. "You want the money? Here it is, but if you drop that flare, I'm throwing these books into the furnace." Harbor spun around, the flare sputtering and hissing in his hand. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and rimmed with a madness that surpassed even Elsa's cold greed. He looked at the ledger, then at Henry, then back at Mona. "You think I care about the books anymore, Mona? Look at this place. Look at our family. It's all gone. The money is just numbers on a screen, but this." He gestured to the flare. "This is real. This is justice." "Justice for what?" Mona stepped closer, her gait uneven but her gaze unwavering. "For the fact that you weren't as smart as Henry. For the fact that you spent 40 years living in his shadow while you bled him dry. You aren't a victim, Harbor. You're a parasite that finally ran out of blood to drink." Henry looked at Mona, his eyes pleading with her to run, but she wouldn't budge. She saw Harbor's finger twitch on the trigger of the flare gun. Behind him, the shadow son's warning about the complication echoed in her mind. She realized Harbor wasn't just waiting to kill Henry. He was waiting for the pressure in the storage unit to hit zero. He wanted to hear the silence from the cold room. "Give me the books and I'll let the girl out," Harbor lied, his voice a pathetic, wheezing rasp. "You don't have the keys to the unit, Harbor. The power is out." "Louisiana is in there and she's dying with her," Mona said, testing him. Harbor flinched. For all his cruelty, he had always been obsessed with Louisiana. The news that his wife was trapped in the vacuum hit him like a physical blow. In that moment of hesitation, Mona didn't throw the ledger into the furnace. She threw it directly at Harbor's face. As he moved to catch the source of his obsession, Mona lunged for the gasoline canister at his feet. She kicked it over, dousing the loading dock and Harbor in fuel. "Drop the flare now, Harbor," she whispered, "and we all go together." The scent of gasoline was a familiar, suffocating veil. Harbor stood frozen, the flare trembling inches from his own fuel-soaked trousers. He looked at Mona, and for a second, the two elders were the only things left in the universe. The hatred between them was a bridge that spanned decades. "You wouldn't," Harbor breathed, though the terror in his voice said he knew she would. "I have nothing left to lose, Harbor," Mona said. "My house is gone. My children are dead or monsters. But I will save that girl, even if I have to burn this entire world down to do it." A sudden, violent thud vibrated through the floorboards. The manual override in the basement had been triggered. The magnetic seal on the cold storage door let out a high-pitched whine as the air began to rush back into the chamber. But the sound wasn't followed by a cheer. It was followed by a scream, not from Becky, but from the shadow son. Harbor's head snapped toward the sound. "The boy," he muttered, a twisted smile forming on his lips. "He always was too brave for his own good." In the distraction, Henry managed to slip his hand through his bindings, which had been loosened by the gasoline. He lunged at Harbor's legs, tackling him to the ground. The flare gun went off, but the projectile didn't hit the fuel. It screamed past Mona's ear and struck the old ammonia tanks lining the back wall. A cloud of toxic, stinging gas began to billow into the room. Mona coughed, her lungs feeling like they were being filled with needles. She scrambled toward the cold storage door, which was now cracked open. She pulled it with the last of her strength. Inside, the room was a nightmare. Louisiana lay slumped against the wall, the lack of oxygen finally claiming her. Bekky was huddled in the corner, barely conscious. But as Mona reached for the girl, a hand gripped her ankle. It was Louisiana. Her eyes snapped open, and she bared her teeth in a final, hateful grimace. If I'm going to hell, Mona, I'm taking the legacy with me. Louisiana's grip was like a vice, her charred fingers digging into Mona's bruised skin. The ammonia gas was filling the hallway, turning the air into a corrosive fog. Mona kicked at her sister-in-law, but the woman was fueled by a supernatural spite. Let go. Mona wheezed, her vision beginning to tunnel. She grabbed a heavy tray of canned goods from a nearby shelf and brought it down on Louisiana's wrist. The bone snapped and the grip loosened. Mona scooped Bekky into her arms. The girl was a dead weight, her skin blue and cold. Mona stumbled out of the storage unit and into the loading dock. Through the haze of ammonia and smoke, she saw a chaotic struggle. Henry and Harbor were locked in a death embrace on the floor, sliding through the slick of gasoline. The shadow son emerged from the basement stairs, blood streaming from a wound on his head. Get her out of here, Henry roared, his voice thick with the gas. The tanks are going to blow. I'm not leaving you, Henry. Mona cried out, but the shadow son grabbed her by the waist, hauling both her and Bekky toward the exit. He's right, Mona. The building is a bomb, the son shouted. He practically threw them through the heavy loading doors and onto the gravel outside. Mona hit the ground hard, her hip finally giving way with a sickening pop. She lay there, clutching Bekky to her chest, as the son turned back to go for his father and Henry. Just as he reached the threshold, the black sedan from earlier roared into the yard. Elsa Wills was behind the wheel, her face a mask of cold fury. She didn't look at the fire or the gas. She saw the ledger lying on the loading dock, just a few feet from the gasoline-soaked harbor. She stepped out of the car, a gun in her hand, and pointed it at the shadow son. Step away from the books, she commanded. But then, the first ammonia tank detonated. The explosion was a muted, pressurized thump that sent a wave of freezing chemical fog outward, shattering the windows of the cannery. The shockwave knocked Elsa off her feet, her gun skittering across the gravel. The shadow son was thrown back into the building, disappearing into the white mist. Mona crawled toward the sedan, dragging Bekky with her. She had to get the girl away from the fumes. She reached the car and hauled Bekky into the back seat. As she turned to look back at the cannery, she saw a figure emerging from the fog. It was Elsa. She was crawling toward the loading dock, her eyes streaming tears from the ammonia, her skin blistering. She wasn't looking for her father. She wasn't looking for her uncle. She was reaching for the ledger, which was now beginning to curl and blacken in the heat of the secondary fires. Elsa, stop, Mona screamed. It's not worth it, the whole place is going to go. Elsa didn't listen. Her fingers brushed the leather binding of the ledger. She pulled it toward her, a triumphant, hysterical laugh breaking from her throat. It's mine, the Scott legacy is mine. At that exact moment, a second, much larger explosion rocked the facility. The main boiler room blew, sending a pillar of fire into the night sky. The roof of the loading dock collapsed in a rain of twisted metal and burning timber. Mona watched in horror as the structure fell directly onto the spot where Elsa, Harbor, and Henry were struggling. The silence that followed was absolute. The cannery was now a mountain of fire and twisted steel. Mona sat in the dirt, the cold night air finally clearing the ammonia from her lungs. She was alone. Her husband, her children, her brother-in-law, all buried under the ruins of their own greed and hatred. But then, the back door of the sedan opened, and a trembling hand touched Mona's shoulder. Bekky was awake. "Grandma?" she whispered. "Is it over?" Mona looked at the fire, then at the girl. She reached into her pocket and felt the small, backup flash drive she had taken from the sub-basement earlier, the real ledger. She began to speak, but her words were cut short by the sound of a slow, deliberate clapping coming from the shadows of the trees. A man stepped out, wearing a suit that cost more than the house that had burned down. "Very impressive, Mrs. Scott," he said, "but you forgot one thing. I'm the lawyer who wrote The man stepping from the shadows was Julian Vane, the Scott family's lead estate attorney for 30 years. He stood in the flickering light of the burning cannery, his silk tie perfectly knotted, a stark contrast to the soot and blood covering Mona. He looked at the wreckage with the detached interest of an accountant reviewing a ledger. "You've made quite a mess of the succession plan, Mona," he said, his voice as smooth as old glass. "Though I suppose it's a cleaner break than I anticipated." Mona pulled Bekky closer to her side, her eyes narrowing. The hatred she felt for her family was now shifting toward this man, the facilitator who had watched her children turn into wolves and did nothing but sharpen their teeth. "The third will," Mona rasped, her throat raw from the ammonia. "What are you talking about, Julian? There is no third will. My husband and I signed the 1998 version together." Vane smiled, a cold, clinical expression. "Henry was a very frightened man before he disappeared, Mona. He knew Harbor was styling. He knew Mike was a liability, so he came to me. He created a contingency. In the event of his death and your eventual passing, the entire Scott estate doesn't go to the children. It goes to a blind trust managed by, well, by me." The betrayal reached its final, most bitter layer. Even Henry, the man she thought was her partner, had acted in secret, distrusting her ability to handle the family's collapse. Or perhaps Vane was lying. The lawyer stepped forward, holding a sleek tablet. "I have the digital signatures. All I need is the physical ledger you're holding to verify the asset list. Hand it over, and I'll ensure Bekky has a very comfortable trust fund. Refuse, and I'll let the police know that you were the one who set the fire to cover up your own embezzlement." He gestured to the gun Elsa had dropped, now lying near Mona's feet. "The narrative is already written, Mona. You're the bitter matriarch who snapped." Mona looked down at the black, charred remains of the ledger in the dirt, the one Elsa had died trying to save. Vane didn't realize it was a dummy, a decoy she had swapped in the chaos. She felt the weight of the real flash drive in her pocket. The lawyer was a shark, but he hadn't spent 50 years surviving the cutthroat world of the Scott family bakery. He didn't understand that an old woman who has lost everything is the most dangerous person in the room. "You think I care about the money, Julian?" Mona laughed, a dry, hacking sound that turned into a cough. "I've watched my children die tonight. I've watched my husband vanish into a furnace. Do you really think a threat of prison scares me?" Vane's composure faltered for a fraction of a second. He glanced at the burning building, then at the road. He needed those files. Without the physical proof of the offshore accounts, the blind trust was just an empty shell. "Don't be a martyr, Mona. Think of the girl. If you go to prison, Bekky goes into the system. Is that the legacy you want?" Bekky gripped Mona's hand, her small fingers trembling. "Don't listen to him, Grandma," she whispered. "I saw him, at the house. He was the one who gave the gasoline to Steve." Mona's heart stopped. The lawyer wasn't just a vulture. He was the one who had provided the fuel for the fire. He had wanted the family to eliminate each other so he could step in as the sole executor. The hatred in Mona's soul crystallized into a single, sharp point of focus. She looked at the gun on the ground, then at the lawyer. "You killed them," she said, her voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. Vane reached into his jacket, his hand moving toward his own weapon. "Business is a blood sport, Mona. And you're out of time." Just as Vane drew his pistol, a hand burst through the debris of the loading dock. It was a scorched, blackened hand, but it moved with a frantic, desperate energy. Harbor Scott, somehow still clinging to a sliver of life despite the explosions, hauled himself out from under a fallen beam. He wasn't looking for Mona or the ledger. He was staring at Vane with a look of pure, unadulterated loathing. You promised." Harbor wheezed, blood bubbling at his lips. "You said it would be clean." Vane didn't hesitate. He turned his gun on Harbor and fired twice. The silenced shots were dull puffs in the night air. Harbor slumped back into the fire, his eyes finally going dark. But the distraction was all Mona needed. She didn't reach for the gun. She reached for the heavy industrial flare she had snatched from the loading dock before the explosion. She struck it against the side of the sedan. The magnesium flare ignited with a blinding, white-hot intensity. Vane shielded his eyes, screaming as the light scorched his retinas. Mona didn't aim for him. She aimed for the puddle of leaking hydraulic fluid beneath his luxury car. "The legacy ends tonight, Julian," she screamed. The fluid caught, and the fire raced up the undercarriage of Vane's car. He scrambled back, but he was trapped between the burning sedan and the collapsing cannery. As the heat intensified, the lawyer's screams joined the roar of the flames. Mona didn't stay to watch. She pulled Bekky toward the woods, her hips screaming, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind them, a massive explosion rocked the earth as the sedan's gas tank ignited. But as they reached the safety of the tree line, a figure stepped out from behind an ancient oak tree. It was Henry. He was burnt, his clothes in tatters, but he was alive, and he was holding a recording device. I got it all, Mona, Henry whispered, his voice a ghost of its former self. He held up the small digital recorder. Vane's confession, the names of the banks, everything. Mona leaned against him, the three of them, the broken remnants of a family, standing in the shadows as the sirens finally converged on the cannery. The betrayal had been total. From the children they had raised to the brother they had trusted, to the lawyer who had managed their lives. They had been surrounded by hatred masquerading as duty for decades. What do we do now? Bekky asked, her voice small and hollow. She looked at the two elders, the people who were supposed to be the weak ones, now the only survivors of a war they hadn't started. Mona looked at the flash drive in her hand and the recorder in Henry's. They had the power to destroy what was left of the Scott name, or they could vanish into the night and let the world believe they had all perished in the fire. The hatred she felt was a heavy burden, a chain that had bound her to this life for 80 years. She looked at Henry, and in his eyes she saw the same exhaustion. They had spent their lives building a kingdom of sand, and the tide had finally come in. We go to the police, Mona said, her voice regaining its steel. We tell the truth. Every ugly, hateful bit of it, and then we let it all burn. As they walked toward the approaching red and blue lights, a dark shadow moved in the bushes. The shadow son, the one who had sent the warning, appeared one last time. He handed Mona a small, velvet box he had recovered from the ruins of the safe. He didn't say a word before disappearing back into the night. Mona opened the box and gasped. Inside wasn't a piece of jewelry or a key. It was a photograph of her and Henry on their wedding day, and on the back, in her daughter Elsa's handwriting, were the words, "I'm sorry I couldn't be who you wanted." Mona clutched the photo to her chest as the first police officer stepped into the clearing, his gun drawn. The trial lasted for 6 months, a media circus that laid bare the rotting heart of the Scott family empire. Mona sat in the witness stand every day, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the empty chairs where her children should have been. She told the story of the fire, the betrayal, and the greed that had turned her own blood into monsters. Julian Vane was sentenced to life without parole, and the remaining Scott assets were liquidated to pay for the pensions of the bakery workers they had robbed. When it was all over, Mona, Henry, and Bekky moved to a small cottage by the sea, far from the shadows of the old estate. There were no vaults there, no hidden ledgers, and no grand legacies to defend. There was only the sound of the waves and the slow, quiet process of healing. One afternoon, as Mona sat on the porch watching Bekky paint a picture of the ocean, she took out the photograph Elsa had left. She looked at the words on the back. The hatred she had carried for so long had finally begun to dissolve into a profound, heavy sadness. She realized that the betrayal wasn't just something her children had done to her. It was a poison they had all breathed in, a belief that wealth was the only measure of a life well lived. The moral of the story: betrayal and hatred are fires that consume the hearth as much as the house. When a family is built on the foundation of greed rather than grace, the walls will eventually crumble under the weight of their own secrets. Mona Scott learned that the only thing more painful than losing a legacy is realizing that the legacy wasn't worth the cost of the souls required to keep it. The story of the grandmother ended not with a bang, but with a quiet understanding. We do not leave behind what we own, but who we loved. And in the end, the only thing that survived the fire was the one thing the others had forgotten to value: the simple, honest truth. Mona closed her eyes, felt the sun on her face, and for the first time in 80 years, she felt truly free. She felt truly free.